us what we're going to do in the future.
Okay, let's get in our seats and close the doors. We're going to do some business here. Are we on? Yeah. About 100 years ago, just as I was leaving my service with the Department of Interior, I was fortunate enough to participate in the founding of the Natural Resources Law Center. And I just want to say that over 25 years later, having attended many of these conferences, I think we can all agree that this was really a wonderful conference at just the right time. And so I want to congratulate all of those that helped this conference live up to its potential, delivered in just the right professional but informal style. And because I sat up here on the dais for a little while, I found the perfect metaphor for the professional but informal style in which this conference is carried out. And if I could ask you to stand up. And if you wouldn't, you look like a limber fellow. Would you mind putting your foot up on this railing right here? That's it. A dress shoe and no socks. So in the future, when I think of this conference, I'm going to think of a dress shoe and no socks. It was very nice yesterday to see. It's been wonderful throughout the conference to see all these terrific students really acting as volunteers to make sure that this conference goes as well as it does, thanks to you and many others. And it was wonderful to see the adjustment yesterday to the rain and to have the whole barbecue moved inside. And the highlight of that, of course, was to see the executive director of the Natural Resource Law Center schlepping the hamburgers up and down the stairs. I actually personally, as a result of that lunch yesterday, ate a veggie burger. And when I told my daughter about that, she was shocked to learn it, but said I'd probably added 15 minutes to my life as a result. The point is that we're at the end of a really excellent conference, and I just want to take a minute to thank everybody who helped put this together: Mark, Doug Kinney, Sarah Bates, all the students who helped out. And of course, I think we can give a special round of applause to the heart of this operation, Heidi Horton.
Let me just add, it's been really hard getting Heidi to accept any acknowledgement for all of the hard work and time that she's put in on this conference, but she really does deserve most of the credit for any success that we had in putting this together. And I hope, I know all of you appreciate it. Many of you have told me how grateful you are for all the work that Heidi has done, but sometimes she doesn't hear that. So I'm glad that we had the chance to do this, and thanks, Guy, for making sure we did.
Now that we've embarrassed her heart out, we'll probably never hear from her again.
You'll like me because I'll fix your parking tickets.
Yes, I will.
All right.
In any event, we are here as a wrap-up panel. You've made it through to the end. I personally think we ought to have awards for all the people who are here for this at the end. If you make it through to the very end, they may have something on a table out there for you. I wouldn't guarantee it, but possibly. You've listened long, and you will listen a little longer. But ultimately, what this panel would like you to do at the end, after making their presentations and maybe engaging in a little crosstalk, is to have you not so much ask questions, but give us your views. This panel has been charged by me as its moderator not to use any PowerPoint, not to come with prepared, not to have arrived at the conference with prepared presentations, but to attend the conference and listen to the conference, and then to tell you what they believe are the outstanding insights, the new ideas they've heard. What are the insights that they have picked up at this conference, and sort of think about it in priorities and suggest to you what they think are the important things, and we have a distinguished panel to do that. And they either will do that, or they will conclude, as I suggested in my email admonition to them, that everything that can be said about the Colorado River has already been said, and there's really nothing more to add. Let me close just by saying, in terms of thinking about the ideas and the thoughts that were here, that one of my favorite figures in scientific history. It's a guy named Immanuel Velikovsky. I don't know if any of you have even heard of him. It's a Russian scientist who was a phenomenologist and a astronomer, and he predicted and tried to identify cosmic phenomena that happened. And he was often right, but often wrong. And the reason he's well known is because he was one of those guys like Leonardo da Vinci who was literally pilloried by the scientific community when he was wrong and really not accepted as a professional. And although many of his ideas were right, but he became emblematic of the scientific community kind of eating its own when they break out of the orthodoxy of whatever the scientific theory or religious theory of the time might be. And Velikovsky had a couple of things he said all the time that were really great that are worth thinking about now. The first is it not the case that an idea, upon being new, is criticized for not being true, and later, when it's proven true, criticized for not being new?
That's great.
Worth thinking about. The other thing he said, which we might consider as well, is when you're at the edge of a precipice, the only truly progressive step is backwards. With that, let's start. We've got the batting order here. I know you know everybody, so let's get going.
Good.
You want to stand up or sit
You want me to
down?
go? Okay.
No, it's Don first.
Don first. Oh, that way. Okay.
Well, we're not going down the road. Don's going first.
Okay.
We kind of talked here and thought that maybe we'd make our presentations from the table. Is that okay?
That's fine, absolutely.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here at the end of this conference. And again, I would also acknowledge that I'm impressed with the folks that have stuck around after lunch for the last little bit of information. I would compliment the Natural Resource Law Center for the conference. It's been stimulating discussion. I think we've had a voice for all points of view, and has been worthwhile, in my opinion, to hear everything that has been said. I came here with the intention of starting my short little presentation on concluding thoughts with a disclaimer that I am the Executive Secretary for the Upper Colorado River Commission, and the thoughts that I'm going to present to you are not presented on behalf of the Upper Colorado River Commission. I'm going to add to that disclaimer a little bit. I also woke up this morning with a real severe back strain. I didn't think I was going to be here, but I can attest to the value of some of our modern drugs. But because of those drugs, the thoughts that I present may not even be my own.
There you go.
But having a little more courage than maybe I normally would have, I would like to just acknowledge that I have heard some great quotes from this group over the years, and I heard two of them during this conference. Pat Mulroy with sitting down on Lake Mead, with Lake Mead being extremely low, and she's anxious about how the water is going to be delivered in this large equalization year, and we're having trouble getting it all out through Glen Canyon's power plants. Made the great quote, I thought, of let our water go. And as I listened to Commissioner Pat Terrell from the Upper Colorado River Commission in the state of Wyoming, as he thought for just a couple of seconds, came back with the quote, you want the water, you can't handle the water. And I thought that was a great quote. And that, putting it with the third great quote that I've heard from Mr. Lockhead a little bit farther down the table, which I will always remember, is when you're in a hole, quit digging. And I think sometimes that's where we are in discussions on the Colorado River Basin. I've learned much. One of the things that I learned or relearned in this conference is that the Upper Basin does not have a delivery obligation, but we have a non-depletion obligation, and there's a difference, and it makes a difference to the Upper Basin. And it makes a difference as we look at those graphs and we project what will be left given various climate change scenarios. So I guess I present that just to say it's complicated. It's hard to simplify it too much because there's always so darn much complication within this river. And almost everything that we think about involves things that we're not thinking about. And we need to be cautious to make sure that we're being inclusive and thinking about all the possible impacts of the actions that we consider. I have heard and take home with me memories of the discussion about the compact. Can it work? Is it obsolete? And it's agreed that many years the compact administration was very rigid. And it didn't need to be unrigid because there was so much water and the uses were so low. But I think what I've learned and what has been clearly stated here is that we have discovered the flexibility of the compact. And my thoughts to the future is you haven't seen nothing yet. There will be significant additional flexibilities and actions that are taken as the stakeholders, the states and the federal government address additional stresses and additional problems. And I don't think you've seen anywhere near what can be done under the existing compact, and it has the ability to react and respond to much more than what we have seen. So I'm leaving with that thought and leaving you with that thought. Secondly, I would say that without question, all of the parties in the Colorado River are going to learn to deal with shortage management better. And I think we're in the early stages of learning to deal with shortage management. And to that one, I also would say you haven't seen anything yet. I think there's going to be many things that are discussed and planned for that help to mitigate, postpone, and then make it a predictable process that is manageable as we deal with shortages. And there will be much done within this basin with regards to that, both in the upper basin and in the lower basin. The upper basin is having these discussions now. You heard Commissioner Terrell talk about our discussions about curtailment. And those discussions not only involve curtailment, but lots of policy issues that affect us today, irregardless of curtailment. They're difficult discussions, but they're discussions that are ongoing and they're important, and you're going to see a lot of change in terms of how everyone tries to deal with shortage management and to make the shortages that we do face tolerable and somewhat predictable and manageable. An additional thought that I will take from this and leave with you is that the long history of the Colorado River Compact and basin planning has in the past been a little bit more narrow, and that I think that you now see that the range of future conditions, that you see everyone beginning to look at the range of future conditions. I think Pat Mulroy said it well when she said she was tired of considering the probabilities or the probable things that may occur and wants to consider the possibilities. And I think many of us have had the experience, and I hope Terry doesn't kick me, of basing decisions based upon probabilities only to find that within the first year or so that low probability thing happened. And the need to address possibilities, and I think that is a changing face of the upper Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin. So scenario planning and the range of possibilities. The next and nearly the last item I wanted to mention is the importance of working with our neighbor country of Mexico, strong stakeholder in the Colorado River Basin. I think it was identified that the next really big thing that is going to occur and is being worked on right now are the discussions with Mexico on incorporating their views and bringing Mexico in with the entire basin as we manage shortage and as we deal with the problems that are involved in both countries. I think both countries see the need. I think both countries see the value. And I think the future will see a lot more communication with the government of Mexico and a lot more involvement of Mexico in the operation of the Colorado River Basin and water management. Finally, other stakeholders. I heard loud and clear that there are stakeholders that don't feel that they have sufficient voice. And to that I also would say I don't think that you have seen anything yet. It's probably true as you look through the history of the Colorado River Basin management, there was little or no voice. In recent history, the voice has been getting louder and being heard more often. But I think it's clear in the future that shortages will impact recreation and the environment, just as it is going to impact the traditional water uses of agriculture, municipal and industrial uses. And there is going to have to be a good dialogue and good discussion of those issues so that they can be adequately considered in their proper context along with all the other uses. So I think that you will see that in the future, and I think this conference has brought that up. And the final thing that I would say is that in addition to demand management and conservation, augmentation is a big part of the future in the Colorado River Basin. It's not a small part of the future. I think it's a big and important part. And I think as we look to the future in 50 years, we will find situations where augmentation can be accomplished, where people are willing and able to pay the price for what is necessary to accomplish augmentation in certain areas, and that has to be part of the portfolio. And with that, I will just conclude my remarks.
Great, okay, thanks. I would echo thanks for coming back after lunch, and we had such a good set of interesting ideas in the sessions this morning. I feel like the Basin Study got a head start on its work for this fall and identifying opportunities. I also wanted to give some credit to Reclamation staff who are here. They pulled some data that you'll see why I'm going to use it here in a minute, but all their work on getting this Basin Study report, as well as our contract folks who are here, CH2M Hill, Blackford Beach, and Intrex. As you all know, it's a huge amount of human effort to do these things. So with that said, I'm going to leave the summaries to these distinguished folks around me so that I don't repeat things that they're going to probably say. When I was thinking about the captive audience we were going to have here, I thought of doing something a bit different. And so I'm going to ask you to work with me here, if you would, for the next few minutes. And this will be the last exercise you have, and then you can sit back again and relax and take in the other folks' comments. So if you remember the cone of uncertainty that we showed, and we're sitting here today in 2011, and we're trying to look out to 2060. And it's tough to do, and it was made even more tough when Holly reminded us that that cone's going to be changing over that future, and so we're going to have to always be doing this idea of looking at scenarios and trying to figure out, are we doing the right things? So I thought what I'd do, since that's such a daunting task, that maybe we could use our time today to start thinking about how we might do that. So my idea is this, let's go back to the future. And if you all saw those movies, probably many of you did. I love those movies. I'm still looking for the sports almanac of the future so I can retire. Haven't found it yet, so I still work at the feds. But, and anyway, let's try that approach. So I won't take too much of our time. Let's put ourselves in 1971. So first of all, let me ask, how many here weren't born in 1971? This is a positive. It is a positive on this basin that so many young people are sitting in this conference. For those of you that were around like myself, think about where you were in 1971. I'll share where I was. I was graduating high school in a small town in Missouri, 40 miles from Joplin, in fact. And I remember quite clearly as a young child sitting in the interior bathroom many, many times. And one thing I wanted to mention that is, doesn't that really fit into our idea of planning for the worst? Do we really plan for the worst? Do we need to plan for the worst? I don't know the answers to those questions, but those will be the questions we're trying to answer as we go forward. One thing I do clearly remember about my time in 1971 is I had a lot more hair, and my father didn't like it. I remember that very clearly. So, how many of you were working on the Colorado River in 1971? Dick. John. Dan is already gone. So that's another very indicative statement, isn't it? And I think it really fits with what Bill Rennie said yesterday. It's about a legacy here. What we're doing today is leaving the legacy for our children and their children. And it's got that level of importance, and I know you all agree with me. So, with that said, it's 1971, so let me frame it up for you. We're going to try to project to 2020 from 1971. Here's how the system looks. Glen Canyon Dam is built, and when the gates are closed, Lake Powell's got about 13 million acre feet in it. It's at elevation 3614. It's 54% full. Just to give you an idea, that's about what it is today, just roughly. Lake Mead's got 17 million acre feet in it. It's at 1154, and it's 66% full. Quite a bit higher than today, but I saw our preliminary projections. If we get what we think this year plus a normal next year, Mead might get about to 1150 again. That's a lot of big ifs. Notice the big ifs in that statement. So here's what was going on. We were operating these two reservoirs for the first time together in a coordinated operation. It was called the filling criteria, and many of you might recall that. If you don't know about it and you're interested, I believe there's a nice write-up in the Colorado River Documents 2008 book that we tried to really put that piece of history down so people would understand it. So clearly we're doing pretty good because we're trying to fill this massive new reservoir, and after about 7 or 8 years, we've got it about half full. And Mead is still 60-something% full. So we're doing pretty good. Normal supply that year was 15.5 million acre feet. The total basin use this year, 1971, including Mexico, is about 13.3 million acre feet. Upper basin's using about 3 this year. Lower basin, 6.6 million acre feet. California's use in 1971 is 5.2 million acre feet, which is about 80% of the total lower basin use. And again, Mexico is using its 1.5. The Colorado River Basin Project Act is in place. 1968 was put in place, and among other things that many of our speakers, including Jim and others, have talked about, we're authorized now to build the Central Arizona Project. We also were told to put in long-range operating criteria, and we put them in last year, 1970. We haven't had to use them yet because we're filling. We're under filling criteria, so those are sort of sitting on the shelf, ready to come out to do the coordinated operation of the reservoirs when we get Powell filled. And maybe finally, the National Environmental Policy Act has been implemented. And it's only been implemented for a year or two, and we frankly don't have a lot of experience with it yet. We know what it's going to mean, probably, to us sitting here in 1971. So that's a snapshot of where we are. Now let's postulate some events and think out to 2020. Okay, we're not predicting, we're postulating. We're trying to look for plausible futures. And the definition of plausible, of course, could be different for each of us. And this is why it takes a group of people to come up with these scenarios. So we're going to break it into blocks, because we can't really look at every 50 years. Let's just break it into blocks. But I have to throw out my disclaimer that this is not an official government survey. It's not FACA, and I'm not going to record it. We'll just do a simple show of hands. So filling Lake Powell. When will Lake Powell fill? How many of us think Lake Powell's going to fill by 2020? Please, a show of hands. Great. How many think Lake Powell will fill by 1980? We're in 1971. About half of us. How about by 2000? Yeah. Well, Lake Powell filled in 1980. Yeah, it did. And that's an interesting little tidbit, isn't it? How many of us foresee a future where we'll need to put plywood boards up as flashboards at the Glen Canyon Dam spillways? How many of us see that? Robert. And of course we did. And we did. And there's a great video, if you've never seen it, I'd be glad to share it with you, of us during that time, and Wayne Cook was the chief engineer. It's a great video. Okay, what about the Central Arizona Project? How many of us now think we'll have that completed by 1980? How about by 2020? All of us. And I'll ask Tom McCann, I'm going to say it was late 80s, but... 93 was 93 then, right? So, and of course, there's still pieces being completed, but anyway, just to let you know. How many of us foresee the passage of an act to protect endangered species? How many of us see that? We're in 1971. Some of us see that. A lot of us didn't, is my guess, but in any event, that is what happened. We're in a year again, of 15.5 million acre feet. Now, we look back in time and we said, hey, the highest flow we ever saw was 24 million acre feet, and it happened in the teens, the 1900s, early 1900s. Over 20 million acre feet's only happened 10 times in the last 65 years, and it was spread out. So how much do we think it's possible to get on the system? How many of us would say it's possible to get 25 million acre feet? Yeah, most of us would say that, wouldn't we? How many of us would say it's possible to get 4 straight years of greater than 20 million acre feet on this system? And of course we did in the 1980s, right? Of course. But we wouldn't have seen that. How many of us would say that the lowest 12-year period on record, we call it the critical period of 53 to 64, and again, remember, we're in 71, will still be the lowest critical 12-year period by 2020? How many of us would have thought that that would still be the worst one? That's interesting. Well, again, with today's inflow forecast, we don't believe we'll break the record, and so we'll see. We don't know the answer to that one. How many of us foresee that the lower basin will develop to their full apportionment? 1971, they're using 6.6 million acre feet, and our friends in California are using 5.2. Okay? Is that going to be full apportionment by 1980? How about by, some say no. How about by 2000? And of course, it was about mid-90s, 1996 or so. Okay. California, as we said, is using over its 4.4 million apportionment, acre-foot apportionment. Legally, I might add, right? Does this trouble us in 1971? Who's troubled by that? And I see my friends from IID have left, I think, so darn it. I wanted to tease them a little bit. How many of us think California will get to 4.4 sometime in the future? We're in, yeah. Not by 2020? Think about it. If we think there'll be full apportionment, do we think somebody else will not take theirs? And we know the Central Arizona project's authorized to be built. That's a tough one, isn't it?
You think California's going to change the rules?
Yeah, there you go. That was probably a plausible future in 1971. Absolutely. So finally, I have just one more, and I appreciate you playing this little exercise with me. I picked on my friends in California, so I got to be fair. When will Arizona get used to CAP's priority being lower than California's 4.4? Will it be by 2020? Forgive me, Tom. Okay, so this is just a little game, but it is what we are doing. This is the exercise that we're playing as we look forward to 2060. So clearly we all had some different answers. We had some common answers. It's really important for you to review and comment on the scenarios we've put out, and particularly on the demand scenarios, because we haven't quantified them yet. And we need your views and your input to help us do that. So Holly had one great quote that I wanted to use at the end. I thought it was pretty insightful. Embrace uncertainty, and now's the time to do that. Thanks.
Kimmery?
Is it me, Guy?
Yep.
Okay, it's me. Hi, everyone. Commented on how impressed we are that you've stayed after lunch. I think you're all nuts for staying after lunch, but I'm kind of nuts myself, so it's fine that we're all here. So just a couple of points. One, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're here talking about climate change in such a significantly different way. Doug Kenny told me that conference, 6 years ago, which had a few less people in it, was, I said, well, how did you talk about climate change 6 years ago? And he said it was kind of climate change 101. This is what climate change is, and this is, maybe what the impacts on water, etc. And, certainly this is a sea change that I think we need to acknowledge. Terry and I were talking about this yesterday about, for the federal agencies, this kind of sea change where all this planning that's in place now, not just for reclamation, but for the other agencies around climate change adaptation, would be really hard to see that being rolled back. And certainly this is the kind of sea change that we've seen at Carpe Diem West over the past 4 years, working with water managers, working with public agencies, working in the NGO community, of again this rapid change from, well, is climate change real? And maybe climate change is real, but we have to focus on mitigation, to this real embracing, we'll use that word again, of adaptation. So I think the question now before us, and what we've heard from this conference, is not, is climate change happening or is real, but will our current institutions and policies be flexible enough and be able to bend enough to meet these plausible scenarios ahead, or do we need some kind of different approach or different institutions to do this because of the enormous, as Holly calls it, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, that lies before us. So that was my first thought, is, is this something we can manage for under our current institutions, or do we need to see a change in that as well? So we've started to hear some conversations at this conference about stakeholder engagement and new parties and new voices at the table. And it was interesting during this morning with the solutions, who's trying to get to solutions, as there was some good questions I know from Norm and others about, okay, so how do we get political traction on this? How do we get public entities and political entities to start making the right decisions? And as I thought about it, I'm kind of in, just because I'm me, I'm kind of in this, well, let's democratize institutions. But that's sort of more of a theoretical thing. I started thinking about what it means to broaden the table and stakeholder engagement. And I think the imperative here and the real practical outcome that needs to happen is that as we go deeper into this time of VUCA in the basin, we've got some significant, major restoration needs, major infrastructure needs. We talked yesterday about, are the flows changing in these watersheds that have been devastated by bark beetles? How are we going to deal with that if that starts to limit flows? We need to start looking at some significant public land management, both for the headwaters, and then as we learn more about dust, and of course, where's most of that dust coming from? A lot of it's coming off of public lands, downwind. So those are the, and also we talked about, we heard about, as Lynn said, land management is water management. Water management is land management. And again, how do we start, cracking that nut of smart land management, which again is going to require political will. So what I see is the opportunity is to build more political capital in the basin. And Bob Adler was up here talking about the different basins, as was Lynn. And I just know that the Everglades got $8 billion for restoration, and the Colorado does not have $8 billion, and we really need that $8 billion. Now, Jim pointed out, when I mentioned this to him, he said, well, Kimry, maybe the Everglades is not really the best example because there are these guys called the Bush Brothers, and things like that. And that is all very true, and I know that the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake have also seen large infusions of cash, again, because there has been, the economic benefits have been identified, but also there's been the political capital and the political will, which, as the political scientists tell us, You build that political capital and will by having a broader participation. Could use some more precipitation too. Participation in what's at stake and what people have at stake. So those are two thoughts, and then just sort of my concluding thought, at the risk of having Heidi and Doug and Mark all commit Harry-Carry in front of us, I would like to encourage the thought of having this conference on an annual basis. I think this conference today, these past 2 days, it's been really quite terrific, and the participation of everyone involved and the quality of the comments. Many of you attend the annual CRUA conference, which has a different flavor and a little bit of a different focus. And I would suggest that it would be helpful to have this conference on an annual basis as well, and have some more cross-fertilization between the two conferences. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Val.
Taylor?
Okay. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Colorado River Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, and I do have to point out the rich irony that I'm kind of only partially at the table right now. I'm kind of falling off the edge. I couldn't resist. But I wanted, I don't think it was even intentional, but it is kind of funny.
Hey, I feel your pain. It's all moved down.
Yeah, I know, it's okay. Yeah, see, Jim's trying to be inclusive. I appreciate that. I was just taking notes the last few days, and I kind of came up with a list of words that just kept coming up. I mean, it just in every presentation, 2 or 3 times. And those words were reliability, flexibility, sustainability, collaboration, and climate change. And so I think if you had to put a theme on there, those are the words that we're talking about. And I do think we've come a long way in just the last 5 years since the last time we had this conference in terms of the way we're talking about this, the way we're thinking about it, the common solutions. And Pat started us out with the premise that so much has changed in 20 years, that she could not have imagined where we'd be today when she started her job 20 years ago. But she also talked about the need to plan for the improbable, which is, I think, and I'll touch on some of the things that Terry touched on as well, but it's the great unifier for us. When I first started this job, a lot of funders and people that I was talking to about the work that we were doing in the Colorado River asked me, well, why now? And I really do think that climate change and the uncertainty that it brings is creating an opportunity for all of us to tackle these problems together and realize that we are in this together, that we realize we have common interest. And so I brought a prop. I'm not sure if people saw this issue of Newsweek. It was last week's Newsweek, and the title is Weather Panic, This is the New Normal, and in parentheses, and we're hopelessly unprepared. And the whole story, well, it's about several things, but it highlights the story of Joplin, Missouri, and how they did actually have a tornado preparedness plan. And then it also goes into talk about other stories about how, New Orleans also had a plan for dealing with hurricanes. Japan had a situation for dealing with tsunamis. And the Murray-Darling, which has started planning for a 6% decrease in precipitation, quickly found itself facing a 35 to 40% decrease in precipitation. And so I think the lesson for all of us is that the reality that they experienced didn't match up with their planning at all. And so I think that's what we have to, the kind of take-home message for me, is we do have to plan for the unimaginable. And I think civic leaders around the country right now are starting to struggle with this issue. And one of the things this article points out is only 14 states are even considering climate change planning right now. And the rest are hoping for a miracle, is the way the article put it. But in Chicago, I mean, it's the scale of what they're talking about is so minor in terms of the scope of the problem. They're planting trees that are native to Louisiana rather than to Chicago because they know they need more trees, but they don't want to plant oaks, which are native. And so they're planting trees that are native to a warmer climate. In New York, they're painting the rooftops of the buildings white so that it will reflect more sunlight and not retain so much heat. These are just really small examples, but what we're trying to do here on the Colorado River, and I hope we'll get there, is groundbreaking. I mean, how do we share a resource like a river that all of us depend on, that we all rely on to support everything that we care about, our economy, our way of life, our quality of life, wildlife, and drinking water? These are all really important things, and yet we have countless stakeholders, and that's why people always talk about, wow, the work on the Colorado River is amazing, because we are kind of coming together. But if we can figure this out here on how to share a resource like the Colorado River under climate change circumstances, that's going to translate into all over the world, the Mississippi and all and the Murray-Darling and places in Africa. I mean, these are issues that we all need to wrestle with. And I heard recently there, and I think we all know this, but it's good to repeat it. There are two ways to affect change. One is crisis and one is leadership. And I think we could all agree that freshwater is just too important to let crisis be the driver, and that we have to have leadership. And if all the examples that we put up on the board the last couple of days of things that we've done on the Colorado River and how they've been so incredible, they all took leadership. And that leadership is we're going to have to ramp that up. And I think one of the things that the Carpe Diem West report said is there is a bit of a vacuum there. And so who is going to step into that vacuum? Is it all of us? I think that's, potential. But I would propose that new leadership has to be inclusive and it has to seek buy-in. And it needs to bring together it needs to be able to meet the social, economic, and environmental needs of this river basin and this community that depends on this basin. And when I was looking up the definition of sustainability, it's the sweet spot where all three of those things come together and meet. And it's not an easy task by any stretch, but we have to bring all of those different parties to the table that understand those different elements to actually find that sweet spot. And I think that's that discussion we've been having about how to broaden the table and bring in those different groups. And as pointed out today and throughout the conference, there are conservation groups, just to do my job as the conservation representative here, there are conservation groups that are ready and willing to be innovative, to come to the table with solutions, to bring resources and capacity, expertise. I mean, this is not your grandmother's NGOs anymore. I mean, we have capacity and we have expertise that I think can help, and we're ready to be part of the solution. And I was pleased to hear Jennifer mention that in the binational negotiations, the NGOs have helped get the ball rolling and have been part of the solution and been constructive. And I think the same is true in the Upper Basin Recovery Program. I think the same is going to be true in the water banking discussions here in Colorado. So I hope that the groups will take us up on that. And I do want to recognize that there's a difference between the compact, somebody talked about that this morning, the role of the compact in the states and how it's a contract. It absolutely is. And there's a different relationship there. But in things like the basin study, it's a different relationship. And that basin study is the foundation for our solutions for the future. And so I hope that we can be part of that discussion and part of those solutions. And I guess kind of related to that, understanding what a river needs to be healthy is an evolving science. It is very challenging. It's not like the last 100 years of we know how much alfalfa needs. Knowing what a river needs is a little bit more complicated, and it does require adaptive management. But I'm hoping we can get past that fear factor of that it'll take away yield and look for those opportunities where we can manage the river in a way that meets the needs of people and the environment, and finds those creative solutions. And just so wrapping up, Pat talked about our collective interdependence, and I think she made a good case of kind of how we're all connected. Well, I've always referred to it as whack-a-mole. It's kind of the water management regime. As you press down over here, something's going to pop up over here. And so that's a reality we're going to have to deal with, and especially as the resources in the basin get tighter and tighter. But everything we do in this river basin affects our neighbors and affects the environment and other communities and other stakeholders. But it is the river that binds us together. And I just hope that as we move forward, we can look at this as a common path, that we can pave the way for other communities to figure out how to share a river, a resource that's important as a river in the future under climate change circumstances.
Okay. Thanks. Well, at lunchtime, I wrote down enough notes to constitute about a 45-minute speech, so I'm going to try and skip maybe Mark invite me back some other time. We certainly heard a lot of old news at this conference, such as that we don't have enough water in the basin. We've known that for decades. The Central Arizona Project was authorized and financially justified on the premise that there was going to be less water to the project in the later years than there were in the earlier years, based on the Tipton study that was referred to earlier. The compact negotiators probably didn't assume that there was less water, but in fact we know that there is less water than they assumed. The upper basin is certainly known for decades about the squeeze and about the fact that we don't know how much water is available for development in the upper basin. In fact, the Colorado legislature confirmed that by spending $500,000 to come up with a study that said the Colorado share was somewhere between 0 and 800,000 acre-feet. We know that the basins, we know what the basin study is going to show. It's going to show long, deep, prolonged shortages based on the various features that are in place. We know, as we've heard, that the guidelines that were negotiated in 2007 are interim for that very reason. We don't know what the future is going to be, so they were negotiated for a way to get us through to the next period so we could figure out where to go from there. So we can stipulate that the entire system is a mess, and so where do we go from here? At Denver Water, we've actually been doing scenario planning for a number of years, and we've used the cone analogy, but at Denver Water we call it the vortex of doom. So that's where we are. We are where we are. We have all these institutions and allocations and everything put into place. And I want to go back to where Pat Mulroy was about let's get pragmatic and figure out where we go from here. As we've heard, we can do two things. It's supply and demand. We can find water from someplace else. Jennifer Gimbel mentioned we can go to Mars, but she didn't realize that the Martians have a new Watershed Protection Act that going to prevent us from doing that. Or we can manage the budget of the system and figure out how demands and supplies can be managed within that budget. And with all due deference to Kimmery's dreams of billions of dollars from the federal government, I'm afraid we're on our own to do that. That's just the reality of where we are. New news is I think we've got lots of opportunities that we've heard in this conference. And what I would like to do is give a little bit of an urban municipal perspective, because that's the seat that I'm in. I can't remember exactly everybody who was on the chart that was either at the table or not at the table from this morning, but I'm not sure that urban municipal utilities were even on the chart this morning. But the fact is that the urban utilities in this basin serve 30 million people, and we supply billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of economic output and sustain a quality of life for human development in this basin. We should be talking about the urban form of development in the West as something that should be encouraged in a sustainable and responsible way. It's clear that urban forms of development are better from an infrastructure and efficiency standpoint. They're better from an energy standpoint. They're better from a transportation standpoint. It's better from an open space and environmental perspective. And the problem is not urban development. The problem is sprawl and allowing urban areas and urban municipalities to thrive. Urban utilities in sustaining the urban form of development are also critical to the form of life that we have. For many people who live within our service area, their environment is the neighborhood that they live in. The lawns that they irrigate, the trees that brings them shade, the ball fields that they play on. That's their world, that's their environment, and they're struggling day to day to make it in that environment. I also want to talk about the urban utilities as taking a broader view. The view is not simply developing, collecting, treating, delivering water, which is certainly our job. But we are not what might be the perception of rapers and pillagers of the landscape. The view of an urban utility is of a place in a broader system. Again, I'll use an example from Denver Water. We're partnering with the U.S. Forest Service to each put in $16.5 million to treat the national forests in the watersheds above our facilities. Our system, our Denver Water's municipal system, consists of our infrastructure, but it also consists of the watershed, the environment above our system, and it includes the river environment of the entire basin, that provides half of our water supply. I think we need to recognize the reality that urban utilities in the basin consume somewhere between 10 and 15% of the water use in the basin. And if we eliminated all the lawn irrigation in all of the utilities, including Los Angeles, Denver, Phoenix, everybody, it's going to make a difference of about, 5%? It's a marginal difference of what will be provided to the river in terms of solving this giant problem that we're facing. And at what cost? What's the environmental cost of that in terms of warming, energy use, quality of life? What's the economic cost of all that? What's the social cost of all that? So pointing fingers at growth, pointing fingers at conservation, saying that urban utilities need to conserve and then all our problems will be solved, is politically expedient, but it is logically, frankly, doesn't make much sense. The answer, I believe, lies in a strategic, incremental, and adaptive approach, combining new supply development by municipalities with demand management and environmental stewardship in the basin. And this is not talk, this is stuff that's already happening. Those partnerships and that type of approach needs to be built on basin-wide, regional, and sub-regional partnerships. And let's talk about new supply, and I'm not talking about water from Mars. What I'm talking about are projects like some of the desalination efforts that are going on in the lower basin, reuse projects that are going on both in the lower basin and the upper basin, efficiency projects that are going on. And it also means working with partnerships on sensible and environmentally responsible and economically sustainable transfers of water. And that involves ag to urban transfers, and it involves water sharing between utilities, and it involves regional cooperation. I'll again talk about the agreement that Denver Water did with the Western Slope. We have a legally binding contractual agreement with the Western Slope of Colorado that we will not develop any further water supplies from the Western Slope without the cooperation of the Western Slope. We are contractually bound and obligated from this point forward to work in partnership with the Western Slope in terms of how we develop water supplies for Denver. Let's talk about demand management. We can talk about demand management at the urban level, but we need to talk about demand management at the system basin-wide level. And we can have those conversations within the existing framework that we have. We have a lot of dynamism in the system. Terry alluded to that when he was talking about the filling. We have the benefit of a tremendous regulatory structure in the reservoirs in the system, and we have the benefit of that system to be able to flexibly manage overall demand in the system without destroying agricultural economies, and managing that water through the system so that we sustain the environment and provide recreational opportunity and protect the riparian environments that are dependent on those rivers. Municipal utilities have been working through the system to do innovative projects such as the Yuma desalting project, pilot run, the QSA agreement, the drop to storage, the innovations in the lower basin that were undertaken through the 2007 guidelines. And it's that type of innovation that, as the water providers for that 30 million people, that the urban utilities can, should, and really must be prepared to step up and use that innovation to be partners with the agricultural community, the environmental community, to create a sustainable future for the basin. Thanks.
Well, I want to add my thanks to everyone for staying, and also begin with a little bit of humility. There are probably thousands of years of accumulated knowledge in here about the Colorado River. And my own knowledge and experience has been episodic, having been at the Interior Department for 8 years and diving in on particular issues, whether it was Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Plan and high test flows, or certainly the 2007 Shortages Sharing Agreement and so on. But what I want to therefore do is to talk a little bit big picture and as a policy wonk from Washington. And I want to begin by saying that there were just terrific insights. For me, this was very much a learning experience, listening to some of the specific details on climate, the legal setting, some of the insights on demand management. And I concur with Jim that really one has to think of that in terms of system-wide rather than in small spaces and places. But there is tremendous opportunity, and I agree with Drew and his presentation that there are many of those opportunities that are untapped. Are they going to solve water problems along the Colorado River? No. Are they part of the picture? Yes. Scenario planning, critically important, and of course all the efficiency options, Jim, that you talked about. But as I listened to this conference and all of the optimism, I was reminded of that long-standing refrain, "Whiskey's for drinking and water's for war," and wondering what became of that refrain. Reflect that this dialogue really has transcended that old context of conflict in many ways. Tensions, of course, alluded to, and the realities of those tensions acknowledged. But nonetheless, much of the conversation was about optimism, whether it's benefits of collaboration, real examples of real problem solving, the trends towards a more holistic focus, and if you will, a moving beyond a metaphor of dominion. And I contrast, for example, that metaphor and what I read in the New York Times a week ago, in which China indicated it's going to move 6 trillion gallons of water from the south to the north to solve the North's drought problems. I think this nation and the Colorado River area has moved beyond that dominion metaphor to a sustainability metaphor. But I want to ask the question, how far are folks willing to go? And here I reflect to the Louisiana Gulf Coast, and after Hurricane Katrina, I was part of a discussion at that time in which the USGS had indicated that we'd lost 100 miles of sea marsh off the Gulf Coast in the last 100 years, and that for each 2.7 miles of sea marsh, one reduces actually storm surge by about a foot. So do the math. That means 100 years ago, 100 miles of sea marsh, Category 5, 30-foot storm surge, hits Louisiana, hits New Orleans at a foot. All of that is gone, and so Category 5 storm, 30-foot, boom, hits that urban population. With those stats in mind, we at Interior, being the nation's leading conservation agency, went forward into the dialogue and said, gee, maybe we need to do things differently and perhaps think of restoring that sea marsh as a critical part to the resolution of those challenges. Now that conversation continues underway, but it very quickly shifted to, again, a focus on hard infrastructure, bigger walls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I ask this community, yes, for all the language about sustainability, for all the recognition of ecosystems and ecosystem services, when push comes to shove, is there a capacity beyond the episodic and the isolated to really think big picture and differently? But I want to probe also some points of leverage for continuing innovations toward building linkages and adaptation, 2 themes which I think everyone has acknowledged are important. Linkages among decision-making entities, urban and rural communities, and so forth, and also the capacity to adapt under changing circumstances. So let me turn to the policy context and just offer a couple of observations as a policy wonk, and start at the federal level. On the one hand, a lot of discussion in this conference about some of the challenges of addressing endangered species issues and the importance of an ecosystem focus, an ecosystem-based focus, and a multi-species focus. While, again, this system has some examples of a multi-species focus, a lot of the litigation on endangered species is still pulling towards a single species focus. Does that create a context in which you really can think big, think multi-species, and thereby have a more nimble platform from which to address those issues? Farm Bill, people talked this morning about agricultural choices and how much they drive water use. And yet some of that decision-making occurs in the context of the Farm Bill and outside of this community. Question mark, to what degree will we see changes there? Budgets. Someone on this panel just mentioned the $8 billion in the Everglades and the need here for funding too. Well, look at the policy, look at the budget context of this nation right now. Just exactly how forthcoming will funds be at the federal level for major investments, be it in new infrastructure, be it in some of the efficiency investments, Jim, that you described, or indeed be it in a more ecosystem services kind of orientation. I think there's some opportunities there, but significant constraints. I am surprised in this conference how little energy has been discussed. You know, particularly in this landscape, and one thinks especially of Arizona, a lot of energy is needed to move water, but then the flip side of the equation is many of the energy choices before us, including renewables, require a lot, the production of energy also requires water. And so I'm surprised that there's been less focus, less conversation in this group about the implications both of energy development for water use, but also the implications for water use in terms of those needs, particularly in distribution, for energy. How reliable are those energy supplies going to be? Indian water rights, of course, looms large. Big ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching dollars associated with some of those concepts. To what degree are those going to be available? But of course, also the bigger question, what implications are there for water usage from those ongoing discussions and resolutions? Bureau of Reclamation, there was a little discussion about how BOR, like the Army Corps of Engineers, has historically been a project-focused entity, project by project by project. When we strived to launch the Water 2025 initiative, is that what it was called? To actually help BOR be a player in helping these communities engage in efficiencies, new technologies, things that would help make sure every drop of water is used well. By golly, it was extraordinarily hard to get that through OMB, to get that up on the Hill. We got a few dollars of change, a few millions for that, but nowhere nearly commensurate with the potential role BOR could play if it was able to have an initiative rather than purely project focus. But that's just the federal policy context. Let's move to the states. Energy choices, much determined by some of the state and energy impacts on water quality, much determined at the state level. What does that future hold for us? The whole context of water trading and banks, much of that foundation, that platform, that context is set at the state level. And the ability, therefore, to do what one needs to do is dependent upon that action. And yet there's a lot of controversy associated with the design of those kinds of programs. Purchase for development rights was mentioned too. That often resides first at the state level, not purely at the local level. And yet a lot of resistance, and particularly in this economic context, for doing anything that would be perceived to constrain economic opportunity. Issues of groundwater management. I was astonished to learn at the Interior Department that we have not done in the nation a water census in over 3 decades. And even when we did one 3 decades ago, it was primarily surface water, and certainly not a census that looked both at groundwater and at surface water and at their interconnections. But again, it's really at the state level that a lot of decisions about that groundwater management, as well as just simply calculating what's there and what the implications from withdrawals are on water might be. Bringing me to the local level, and we've now heard this refrain again and again, water management is not water management. Water management must intimately be tied to land use management. And we're seeing, as I mentioned yesterday, Tucson, but we're seeing that interconnection of land use management and water management only very episodically. To what degree will we see replication of the Tucson kind of image or vision to the degree that it can actually make a difference for the whole system? I don't know whether this is a federal, a state, a local issue, but talking about agriculture and water use in agriculture and perhaps agriculture demand management and some of the excellent presentations this morning, I was interested that very little of that discussion, though, really then turned to the issue of global food security. I came from a conference at the Aspen Institute last week in which whole sessions were on both expected population levels over the next 20 years or so and the current trends in population growth and food production. and some prognostications about a potential gap there. What impact is that going to have on the willingness to look at agriculture and changes in agricultural practices as they relate to water? Now, by the way, I am not one of those sky is falling kinds of neo-Malthusians. I think, it's precisely the recognition of some of those projections that causes us to think differently and do differently and respond and act and solve problems. But I just put it out there. And then finally I get to the compact and the policy context there. You all know way more about this than I do, but again, some really tough issues at further shortage sharing considerations. Should water availability flow below the levels that were anticipated in the 2007 agreement? And there's been a lot of discussion about storage and the need for augmentation. I understand those discussions and that need, but I think there are different ways to think about augmentation, sort of old-fashioned, or perhaps as Drew put it, 19th century ways, build big things, or looking at kind of incremental ways to enhance augmentation that fit more with an ecosystem kind of sustainable context. And then let me just conclude by saying that this has been sort of a kumbaya conversation, unfolding, yes, a kumbaya conversation, but when I leave here and go back to Washington, holy cow, it is not kumbaya. We have there a context of intense political conflict, more intense than I saw when I came into the Interior Department in 2001. Key dialogues critical to these communities here are either muted. I mean, you can barely mention the word climate change. I was kind of shocked to hear it mentioned here. Because in Washington, let me tell you, this is Boulder. So, but right now in Washington, I've had serious conversations with folks who say, oh, golly, we know we need to think about climate adaptation as well as mitigation, but we don't dare even mention the word. So the dialogues that are key are either muted or they're taking place in the context of what I would characterize as zero-sum positioning, a very old-fashioned kind of either-or rather than the search for the sweet spot. And in a way that makes it difficult even to think about searching for the sweet spot. So anyway, and then just a couple of other comments there. I think in the discussion about climate here, it's been really excellent. A lot of the focus on the water effects, changes in precipitation patterns and timing and whatnot. But Dennis Rule and I yesterday were talking, and he raised the issue of fire. You got a fire in Arizona right now, bursting forth. One of the things we discovered on our climate change task force is that the fire season in the West is now 78 days longer than it was just, say, 30, 40 years ago. Now, if you have fires of more frequency of 400,000 acres like is right now unfolding in Arizona, and we saw this kind of fire sequence more and more even in the 8 years I was at Interior, what does that mean for the landscape? What does that mean for water? What does that mean for vegetation composition? So I'm interested, and I urge you and invite you to think about that piece of the climate FX scenario. So let me just conclude, though, with having said all that, that I am a Pollyanna, optimist, rosy-colored glasses person, and I do see many points of light, and it was really, really inspiring and terrific to hear them here. Lots of points of light, and I think lots of recognition that collaborative problem solving can help in a big way, not always, but often overcome conflict. But I guess I ask you, are there really the right forums for collaboration to occur, not simply at the community level, but at the compact level? And several people pointed out the fact that so much compact level discussion occurs among states and without the broader set of people at the table. It's my conclusion that there's an illusion of efficiency in exclusion. That is, you appear to make faster decisions if you can limit the size of the table. but it comes back to haunt you one way or the other at some point in time. So that's yesterday I ended with the words of Yogi Berra, that fine philosopher, so today I'll end with the words of Forrest Gump, that other fine philosopher who said, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, thank you all very much. Very, very enlightening and very provocative. I promised the panel that I wouldn't say anything so long as everything had been said and covered. And by and large, I had my list of things that during the conference I just didn't see them coming up. And this panel, I knew with the great people we had on it, would cover most of them. And in fact, they did. There's just a few thoughts that I want to add at the end before I ask the panel if they have anything they want to say to each other, either to engage in the continuation of the love fest or to tell the other people that they don't know what they're talking about. One is to say, just to recognize, and this sort of goes to the person who talked about having another conference, that every conference has its limitations. And I've talked to Doug and to Sarah, and it was very hard for them to come up with the panels and the order and the topics that they did. And necessarily in the course of a little over a day and a half to cover as much ground as they did. In doing so, however, things just don't get covered. One of those that was high on my list, to get you at the very top, that Lynn finally pulled out, I thought it was great, was energy. That we simply didn't get to energy. And it isn't the fault of anybody, but if there is another conference, we simply have to talk about the role of energy in the West and the role of energy in terms of its effect on water supplies everywhere, including the Colorado River. Second, clearly, and although we got to it this morning, I think there's a tremendous deficit in terms of talking in a practical and let me say hard-edged way about the role of agriculture here. I had to think when I was listening to Drew Beckwith's excellent presentation and watching the lively mind that he had, that it was kind of a shame that what he was doing was applying that intellect and that energy to fine-tuning municipal water pricing, as opposed to really going after the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is agricultural water consumption in the West. When somebody joked earlier about what you're having for breakfast, alfalfa or cotton, it was right on target. Why is that? Why do we not have a dialogue which challenges and makes an item of clear conversation the fact that huge chunks of water, way more than enough to be able to make up for the kind of deficits that we're looking at in other places, including in-stream flow and environmental purposes as well as urban and municipal uses. Why is it that that's not a part of the conversation? Why is it that that is not a much more vital part of the debate about water use? So I don't think we can possibly have another conference talking about this unless we have an honest way of talking about agricultural consumption. And of course, it's complicated, it's high conflict, and my professional life, as many of you know, has been spent divided between the West and Washington, D.C., but I mostly look at the federal end, and I look at it from a policy perspective. And so I have been able to deal not only with issues like the Colorado River, but I've been intimately involved with the Bay Delta crisis. And the reason that the Bay Delta crisis has been prolonged, and it's been prolonged for decades now, is because of exactly what's happening now, both in the Congress and in the courts, and that is that the agricultural community simply will not accept a long process of planning and collaborative management that's been proposed to deal with those problems. They won't accept it. They will go to court first, and they will have their representatives introduce a bill in Congress, which frankly is a ridiculous bill. You can tell them I said so. And that's the problem. And we had speaker after speaker here say that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid plunging the Colorado River into a situation in which litigation is the resort of key people, of key interests in the basin. So my thought is that in a future conference, I'd like to see the kind of energy we devote to talking about the plumbing, as we do in a lot of this, and talking about management of the plumbing, to talking instead about how we deal with the consumption issues and how we deal with agricultural consumption. Because if you can solve even a little tiny part of that problem, you've solved many of the other problems in a very big way. And that leads me to sort of the main observation I want to make, and I promise you this will be short. I'm a victim of the world I live in, which is one in which I reduce all of these wonderful and progressive academic and legal and technical points that are made in a conference like this, always to me get translated through a filter of politics and how they either become a reality by being integrated into local, state, or federal law or policy, or they don't. And so I think one of the things that we might want to consider in a future conference, in addition to turning our attention to things like the energy-water nexus and the agricultural consumption issue, is to see, and I'm not sure how to do this, I'll have to think about it myself, is to try to think of ways in which we can engage the political part of it, to sort of think through how some of these issues are played out in a political way. And I don't mean by that just talking about bills moving in Congress, but what is the dialogue about? Why is it that we don't have a realistic dialogue about the fact that 80% of the water is consumed by agriculture and so on down the line? Why don't we have a conversation about that and try to figure out why it isn't more commonly understood that that's what the situation is? Part of it is communications, part of it is political, but I think we need to build that equation into it, because it all can't be solved at conference tables and in courtrooms. It has to be solved in political and policy conversations. So those are my ideas for going forward. And I just want to say at the end, a special thank you to Larry McDonald from my perspective. He made me proud that he was the first executive director we hired for the center, followed by people like Jim Martin, who was up here until just a minute ago, and of course now Mark. But Larry, I thought that your presentation of thinking of the unthinkable was a gift to all of us, because it reminded us that we're living in a finite world, and the sooner we accept that as a basis for discussion, the better off we are. So that stuck with me, and I really appreciate it. Okay. You guys have anything to say to each other?
I'd like to hear from these folks.
Yeah.
We've been
All right,
battling
well,
at them for long enough.
All right, we have been talking to you for a couple days here, so I'd like to encourage any of you to not just ask questions, but stand up and tell us what you think were the most important things you heard here, what resonates. And the guy with the dress shoes and no socks will be coming up into your area.
Since I'm sitting on the aisle, Mary Kelly, I completely agree with what you just said about agriculture, and I have been thinking about this a lot in some work I've been doing, and it seems to me that agriculture in this basin has, for the last 50 years, pretty much gone along the way it's been going on for a very long time. But it's now facing a conjunction of major change forces, from aging infrastructure to aging farmers to more pressure on its water, differences in food prices, and now potentially less federal price supports and subsidies. And I think now is really the moment to try to reach out to sort of more forward-thinking elements in agriculture. But the challenge is, and I'd like to hear anybody's views on this, is, and I don't mean any disrespect to anyone from this, but the organized segment of agriculture is legitimately maybe concerned about just holding on to the water they have. How do we sort of reach beyond that one organized segment of agriculture and maybe bring in some new voices from people that are thinking about farming and the viability of agriculture in this basin for the future?
We have someone here with us who can talk to that very directly, and he's right up there. Would you take the phone up to Mark Pfeiffer? Mark, hold up your hand. Mark is the general manager of Aurora Water, And Mark has been participating in an ag-urban set of discussions. And I want to make it clear that my remarks are not meant to be, quote, anti-agriculture. It's that that issue has to be on the table. But Mark, I think it might be useful for you to just say a word about how that process has gone.
Well, we brought together a number of municipal entities, agricultural interest, and NGOs. Taylor was part of that process too, and tried to engage in a dialogue to find areas of common interest to see what we needed to do to facilitate resolution to the common problems that we all face. And we did identify some areas where we could work cooperatively to move water in the future in a more efficient way, if you will. One of those, frankly, and this is something I was going to bring up, was how to reduce the transaction costs associated with moving water either on a permanent or temporary basis between agriculture and urban interests. Because the transaction costs are, at least from a municipal perspective, eating us alive. The other one was storage. How do we maximize the use through the construction of new storage facilities that are not necessarily for one use or the other, but multi-beneficiary buckets, if you will. So those were areas of common ground. And then we also were willing to, I guess, branch out a bit and look at ways to move water out of agriculture that don't economically hurt the agricultural or rural communities. One way would simply to be, and I think you can do this with the technology we heard about this morning, identify those areas that you're irrigating where the return per acre really is quite poor because the soils are not really adapted to irrigated agriculture. You move it off poor lands or lands that actually exacerbate water quality problems because they're very saline. The return flows are terrible for the ecology. So you identify those, and that's the water that you move out. We also talked about engaging in urban-rural transactions where water was not the only commodity on the table. It's the economic well-being of the rural area. So you actually have like an enterprise zone created that encompasses both the city and the surrounding rural area, where you have an interface that is not only water movement, also product movement. In other words, if they grow and produce wheat, why doesn't the municipal help them process the wheat and actually maybe even bake bread out of it and sell the end product, and keeping that money chain, if you will, in a more local nature. And so there's a lot of creative ideas out there if people put their mind to resolving them. And as long as I have the microphone. I mean, one of the things I was going to identify, and Jim's acutely aware of this, and he put his finger on it and he said, the state has no money, the federal government really has no money. As municipal water providers, we're going to probably have to financially solve the problem. Well, the concern is, though, that, I mean, Aurora's taken a lead really in leasing fallowing, and we paid top dollar for the agricultural water that was moved temporarily. We've taken a lead on reuse and paid $654 million for a reuse project we just completed. We've taken a lead on conservation at no small expense to our ratepayers. We've now reached the point, though, and the fellow from Albuquerque newspaper sort of underscored this, where the only thing people read is their bill, their monthly bill. They don't read the background pieces about where does your water come from and why does it cost this much, etc. They read the bill, they call the city council person, they moan and groan. So what can we do to reduce transaction costs at the state and federal level? If they're not going to give us money, give us regulatory relief. And what can we do as a group to get by this ratepayer negative reaction and maybe find a source of income on an individual basis that isn't, though, doesn't wind its way into the utility bill? I mean, some sort of other taxing or income generating process.
Other comments? Yes, sir. Remember, you're thinking of the most interesting, insightful, new ideas you heard in this last couple days.
I want to share, Lynn and Guy, your concern that energy was not discussed in depth here. And I do want to point out that on July 20th, it will be discussed at the Gunnison Water Workshop. in Gunnison, Colorado. And I think it's a timely discussion that would help supplement the discussions we heard here tonight, or today, and the last few days. And Mark, as far as regulatory relief goes, be proactive in meeting responsibilities so that regulatory impositions aren't needed.
Other comments? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question more than a comment. My name's Callie Cardone from my country news. So I guess it's a political question. I'm wondering kind of like how much the dysfunction of our national conversation about climate change matters in all of this. So I guess like to what extent does the toxicity of talking about and dealing with climate change to what extent does the political toxicity of climate change limit or not limit the ability of planners and managers along the Colorado River?
Let me give you just a real quick answer to that. I mean, the panel can answer, but let me tell you a story. I mentioned the other night at a dinner. There is in Washington a group of the big water agencies. American Water Works Association, American Metropolitan Water Agencies. There's about 15 or 20 of them that represent national water, shades of the national water community. I participated on behalf of this Western Urban Water Coalition. And we meet on it's called the Climate Change Coalition Ad Hoc or something like that. We meet on it, and the biggest single project of that group, which is all the Washington representatives of the major national water associations, is the fact that in the big climate change bill that you've all heard about, the one that Al Gore talks about and John Kerry's involved in, the greenhouse gas bill, in that bill, do you know that there's not a single meaningful mention of water anywhere in that huge bill? Yet water is the canary in the mine, as anybody in the West knows, on climate change. But our project is simply to get them to pay attention to the issue of water. It's amazing.
I guess my question is more like for the planners and managers working on Colorado River issues now, like to what extent does the political toxicity limit their ability to smartly and effectively plan for all of the uncertainties?
You know,
sorry.
You know, just to briefly address that, you know, in our larger Carpe Diem West leadership network, there are people within our network who are water managers who do not feel comfortable using the words climate and change consecutively in a sentence, but they're smart people. They're experienced water managers. And, you know, our shorthand is, you know, they know that there's a bad moon rising of this disconnect between supply and demand trends. So Taylor was talking about finding that sweet spot. And I think that's one of the beauties of water, that it, you know, it permeates everything. It's essential to life. And it's that sweet spot that in the American West we can come together and find common ground.
I guess I'll take a different tack. As it relates to planning and adaptation, that is, taking that scientific knowledge about anticipated or potential effects of a changing climate, the status of the national conversation does not need to impede, and indeed does not appear to be impeding, those adaptation efforts. You know, local communities are where the rubber meets the road. They are the places that are already seeing increased intensity or increased frequency of high-intensity storms. Their existing infrastructure simply, you know, it's one thing to have a 100-year storm every 100 years. It's another to have it every 5 years. You simply can't be operating in that kind of crisis condition. So it doesn't impede that, but I think it goes back to a comment yesterday, which is there are really two parts to the climate discussion. One is adaptation and the other is mitigation. And it's very difficult, while individual communities, states, can and are moving forward with some mitigation efforts, ultimately to address greenhouse gas emissions takes a broader, concerted, indeed not simply national, but indeed global effort. And that's where the discussion really stands in the way of productive problem solving and policy making. And if I just add one more piece, one of my bugaboos in that conversation is that there tends to be a conflation of legitimate discussions over the policy tools, and that is what strikes the right balance of achieving goals and in a cost-effective way, with a discussion about climate science itself. And it's quite one thing to have that very legitimate policy discussion, concern about cost, impacts on economy, but to take your concerns about that and then use that to squelch the discussion on the science or the existence of the problem itself, I think really does a disservice to the public.
I would agree with that, and I guess only in Washington can the internet actions of a representative devolve into a partisan debate. And frankly, for those of us who are on the ground trying to manage and develop water supplies, the reality is that things are changing, and we need to plan for that, we need to prepare for it, we need to deal with it, because that's the reality, and that's the reality we're dealing with. So we're talking actively and planning as actively as we can for climate change. We have staff people in-house that are climate scientists. So it's a major part of our focus on municipal supply planning.
I've got I'm next.
Yeah,
I've got the mic. So I'm gonna take it and
always have the mic.
Say a few words. First, I would be remiss if I did not introduce to you the guy with dress shoes and no socks, who has been so patient walking around with the microphone and taking the time. So I thought I'd just spend a moment doing that. It's Neville Wilder. Until very recently, Neville's been working with Ann Castle, who most of you know is Assistant Secretary for Water at the Department of the Interior now, and he was working there as an intern. He's volunteering with us this summer, and was kind enough to help us and sit here patiently through all this. So we ought to probably give Neville a
Here.
I want to mention two things. They are, I suppose, in the nature of shameless promotions for the center, but I think they're very relevant to much of what we're talking about here this afternoon. First, Doug Kenny has edited a book on the energy-water nexus that is about to come out. I don't think it's actually going to be in print until the end of the calendar year, but it is done and it is at the publisher, and so you may want to watch for that. If you want more information about it, you can email any of us and we'll get you the information. When we were talking about this conference and decided on the Colorado River, our alternate idea was the energy-water nexus. So just so you know, we have been thinking a great deal about that issue, and Doug, of course, has been writing about it. I wanted to also add my 2 cents, I guess, on this question of ag use and the importance of ag in the whole equation. I think I raised a question earlier about it. I've been thinking a lot about this. I'm in the middle, actually I'm at the end of a study we're doing for NOAA on ag to urban water transfers. We hope to have a report in draft form at least out by the end of this month. And there are lots of things in it that I'd love to talk about some other time. But one thing I want to mention that I think shows the need not just for creative solutions, but I think also for some potential reforms to the current system has to do with consumption of water by crops. Now, most of us understand, we talk about water consumption and transfers, and we know that alfalfa, for example, is a high consumption crop. I just want to point out, though, that there's a real opportunity here. As I see the current law, the incentives for farmers are almost always to use or adopt those more water consumptive crops, particularly if they have any inkling that sometime down the road they may want to transfer their water rights, because as most of us know, the water rights that you get to transfer are based upon your historic consumptive use. And so if you've chosen a less consumptive crop, the incentive, basically it's a disincentive for you to be growing that less water consumptive crop. And it's possible, at least, for us to imagine reforms that might gain the support from some in the ag community, at least, that would allow the farmer to maybe have an incentive to grow the less consumptive crop in exchange for the opportunity to sell the extra consumption that they've historically been making. with the higher consumptive crop. Anyway, we're going to be sort of teasing out this and many other issues in this report that's coming out at the end of this month, and I just wanted to highlight that one issue for you, and we can talk about that maybe some other time. Thanks.
Does Neville always give you the microphone when you ask for it?
Absolutely. That's part of his
All right, any other comments? Yes, sir, right down here.
One in the back, too.
Then Neville had to come, and then he had to be ridiculed by me for not wearing socks after all that hard work.
Jorge Figueroa from Western Resource Advocates. My question is specifically for Lynn, but everybody in the panel can answer. In terms of climate change and adaptation, it seems to me that in the arid West, water is the most vulnerable, or one of the most vulnerable resources in terms of the effects of climate change. And in the discussion of climate change and adaptation, it seems to me that it's pretty clear that for managing the water resources in a time of uncertainty, one of the things that is predominant is specifically with water is adaptation versus mitigation. Obviously, you need to deal with the effects of climate change at the same time. If we're looking at more than 50 years, 100 years ahead, but if we're planning for 50 years ahead, it's really adaptation that we need to be worrying about. But internationally, people have been talking, until recently, people have been actually acknowledging that adaptation should have the same focus as mitigation. In the United States, that's not true. Right now, people are still debating whether climate change exists. So adaptation is not really dealt with in a very rational, practical way. So my question to Lynn is, can you talk about a little bit about adaptation and freshwater resources? And also, I just want to plug the work that Western Resource Advocates is doing in terms of conservation and smart water strategies. I think that in a world in which we have to embrace uncertainty, one of the certain things that we can do in terms of water management is to manage ourselves.
I disagree with the premise a little bit, but let me explain why. I mean, I agree absolutely that as it relates to water, certainly adaptation is front and center stage, and it's what water communities need to be thinking about. What I disagree with is that adaptation is not getting significant focus. It's just getting focus in different venues than, say, the Congress. Tremendous amount of focus on adaptation is occurring at the city level, at some state levels. Almost every major city in this nation now has some sort of adaptation planning underway, some of it quite robust, some of it minimalist. Many states also have engaged in trying to understand the effects of a changing climate. Similarly, even in Washington, at the federal level, the land and resource management agencies are quite engaged. Bureau of Reclamation, actually one of the earliest to actually step forward and say, you know, when we do our annual operating plans, we cannot be using data or relying solely on historical data, you know, going back on the 100-year average, because that's really not going to give us the information we need. So they've been at that effort of revising their models for quite a while now. So I guess I would summarize in two ways. One, there's an awful lot going on, but not in the federal congressional level, but really where it rightly belongs, with the purveyors and users and managers of infrastructure and water and places. The second point I would make is that climate adaptation actually addresses the many effects of a changing climate, and those tend to be highly location specific. Even with water, it's not that the nation is seeing a uniform change in precipitation patterns or frequency of storms or whatever, and so those tend to be very location-specific responses, therefore less visible, perhaps, than things like discussions on mitigation policy. So I think there's a tremendous amount going on, and that's, I think, good news.
Martin?
Just a quick thanks to Lynn for bringing up, I think, the two subjects, and we really got started into one that's going to take a lot more to get to the bottom of, and that's the whole agricultural water use, and particularly the energy comment that you made, Lynn. Mark, you're talking about people who want to read their bills and complain, and the term apathetic ignorance comes to mind. I think one of the things that I think the water community is frustrated about is the lack of awareness and understanding by the general population of where their water comes from, how it gets there, and how important it is to fund the infrastructure, the planning, and the kind of things we've been talking about in the room to do. I'll give you another newly published book that is came out by the World Economic Forum. It's called The Water, Food, Energy, Climate Nexus. So now we have 4 things in the Nexus title. I'm just getting into it, but one thing that has struck me is that as informed as we are about water and our understanding of how to manage water and what the challenges are, it strikes me even this far into this book how little we probably know about the other aspects of this nexus. Where does our food really come from? Is it really appropriate to be eating fresh grapes in December? And what did it take to get those grapes here? So I think we'll all have to get better educated in the rest of these functions to be able to come up with the kinds of solutions and think about those plausible scenarios, Terry, that you're talking about for the future.
Others? Can't have exhausted your creativity.
It's worn out.
There's up there, Mike Galetta, we're in the back.
Thanks. Mike Galetta from the Solicitor's Office of Interior, and this is more of a comment and perhaps some perspective. I found myself in the early 2000s sitting in the Department of Justice, starting work on a whole slew of litigation related to the law of the river, starting with the litigation that IID brought against the Bureau of Reclamation when BOR reduced IID's water allocation that year. Hard-fought litigation ultimately led to negotiations and execution of the QSA, in which California agreed to live within its 4.4 million acre-foot entitlement. That was followed by other cases. All-American Canal Lining, another example of where the government was trying to do a project and get the districts in California within their entitlement. Litigation was brought by business interests in Mexico. We got through that litigation. The lining project was completed. There were other cases, a lawsuit by the Navajo for breach of trust for not taking into account their Federal Reserve rights in management of the river. Environmental litigation involving the Salton Sea, issues that are still unresolved. So it's encouraging to have sat here the last couple of days and gotten more insight into the new era of cooperation on the river, and it's great to see that. Despite being a litigator, it's very heartening to know that the parties on the panel, in this room, those on planes back to DC right now into the far corners of the West have really rolled up their sleeves and dealt with some really difficult issues. And I think in some of those early instances, it was the ongoing litigation and the threat of future litigation that prompted those agreements and compromises on various positions. And so I applaud the people that have been involved in that, and I encourage you to continue those efforts despite the fact that there may not be a call for 25 years, despite the fact that we perhaps don't face the immediate prospect of the unthinkable, and continue to deal with the hard issues. And rest assured that the Department of Justice will be ready to take on the issues should there be future litigation, but also rest assured and take heart that the Department of Interior and the overall federal government will continue to engage and to work hard to help achieve solutions for all of these issues that we've been discussing.
Let me underscore that. As having been involved in these conversations and negotiations for 25 years, we've seen relationship with the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation, the Park Service, and all of the interior agencies that has been steadfast through changes in administration. In the Babbitt administration, we accomplished a heck of a lot. In the Gail Norton administration, we accomplished a heck of a lot. We are continuing to move forward in this administration. And again, talking about non-partisan working relationships, Interior has, and the interior agencies have been a steadfast partner of state and local entities in moving forward to that kind of future that we're aiming for. So that, I think that needs to be recognized. Have you dealt with that? You lived it, so I mean, it's
I
It's an
was
important
going to
partnership.
say thank you. I mean, my 8 years at Interior were the privilege of a lifetime, and at least in part, that is because of the dedicated civil servants that work there that really are trying to solve problems.
Absolutely.
Anyone else?
There's a question in the back.
I was just wondering if any of you, Clark Tate with the Tamarisk Coalition, if any of you had a vision for the forum. I heard Lynn and Taylor talk about a forum to bring in more people into this discussion, and we talked about how energy and agriculture wasn't discussed, and that's probably because we don't have the right stakeholders here who are bringing up that discussion, and that's what I would think about. And the public education piece of that, getting the public more educated, and at least the really dedicated stakeholders. And Jim, I know you were talking about earlier, we do have these networks that bring people in at different points during the discussion, but there's kind of the sliding scale of networks, and as the structure, so I think there's a very loose structure right now, and as the structure becomes more formalized, you move more towards those Chesapeake Bay program type of second order organizations, I think they're called in the literature, and it's more rigid, and we've talked about the need for flexibility, but you can also kind of insert that type of opportunity for flexibility through things like looking back at the compact at certain times and through having conferences where you have these kind of discussions. So I was just, this is a bit of a ramble, but to wrap it back to the need for that forum and what that forum could look like along the sliding scale of networks. Does that make sense?
This is something that Carpe Diem West is going to be doing next. As you know, we released our Thinking Like a River Basin report, and one of the findings in that was this attention on the need to have broader stakeholder engagement. And just to clarify, it's not that everyone that we interviewed, the basin leaders that we interviewed, liked that idea. But they saw increasing pressure for that to happen. So one of the things we're going to be doing, again with Sarah Bates's help, is doing an analysis of what are the other kind of stakeholder engagement processes that have been used in other basins, primarily in the United States, but maybe some internationally as well, and then look at that specifically at the basin and how that might match up for the basin. So that's going to be our next step in terms of, so what might that larger stakeholder forum look like?
And I guess I would add, I think the basin study is a potential forum. Right now, it's a relatively small group, and I think we could, as we move from the technical aspects of it right now to the solutions phase, I hope that that group can broaden out a little bit and we can actually get as many people involved in the solutions discussion. We've talked to Terry about this a lot, so I think he agrees. So that could be one forum, and again, how those solutions get implemented is a whole other question, but, and there may be a need for, form follows function, what kind of implementation structure do we need to implement those things, may take us down a whole new path that we're not even thinking about right now. I do think we'll see more issue-specific forums created. We had this ag, urban, environmental, water sharing group come together, and it was just kind of, it was a first step to even see where the common ground was. I think we need more forums like that just to bring the different perspectives and interests and ideas to the table, and then hopefully one of those can, the ideas that come out of that, we can run with them. I also think that we are just now, and Clark and I have talked about this too. We're just reaching a point now where we're seeing ourselves as one basin. And I often tell the story, I was back in DC meeting with high-level officials at OMB, and I showed them my map of the Colorado River, and they said, oh, we've never thought about this map, this river as one river. We thought about it as an upper basin and a lower basin. Mexico wasn't even in the mix. So we're just now getting to that point where we can even see ourselves as having a common identity, and I think we need to foster that. I don't know if we need a formal structure or not, but I think that's something we're going to need to kind of embrace and see that we all affect each other and how we can create those solutions together.
Okay, I think let's take one more question. You have the mic.
Joe Barsigli at Western Water Assessment. I guess that was the first half of what I was going to ask, but that was a great question. The second one comes back to Lynn Scarlett's point, and I'll keep it fairly high level at this end of the conference, about framing and framing questions being an essential part of moving. And I would really like to hear, whatever your thoughts are, anybody wants to talk about this, how you get to, how you tackle that issue of framing the questions cooperatively but differently.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of fragmentation in what I heard today, and so getting frames that work.
I think Eric Kuhn talked a little bit about that yesterday when he talked about how his board has such a diversity of opinions, about climate change and what that means. And he said, what we do, at the district is we listen intensely to everyone's opinions. And then we start talking about what the plausible scenarios might look like, and then see where we can find common ground and go from there. And I know that everyone in this room is just going to absolutely groan at this, but we need to have a lot more conversations. We need to have more meetings where people can sit down and say, okay, where are the commonalities? What are some of the possible scenarios? This is some of the work that we're doing with our Healthy Headwaters project within Carpe Diem West, which Mark and Mike and Jim and others are a part of this conversation of you start reframing issues. If you look at climate change impacts on headwater systems in the American West, and what does that mean for downstream water security? And all of a sudden it's a different reframing because downstream water agencies are starting to go, wow, yeah, we need to pay attention to the whole watershed and to be a part of that conversation.
I guess that's I think a very useful response. I guess I would offer two thoughts. Often we convene with our familiar colleagues and immediately begin with stating the problem and then discussing the possible solutions. And I think what I was trying to hint at yesterday was that it's useful, particularly when we're at this cusp of sort of changing conditions, rather than to start with the problem, to actually say, what's the question? But that is more fruitful if one has a setting like Kimmery described, where you're not bringing in the traditional players, but actually have fresh faces and voices who in fact are going to help you think outside of the box and shape those questions. Now, what that means here and for the Colorado River, I think that gets back to the question asked there about what the possible forums are.
Would you all join me in thanking this wonderful panel?
And thank you, Guy, for moderating that wonderful panel. So this brings us to a close. Once again, go forth, be mindful, and I hope we'll see all of you again next year. Thanks very much.
You get it back 7 then? You get it back 7?
No, I actually.